Chapter 33 Wedding Bells. Ariel.
I still can't believe we're going to Bela's wedding tomorrow. It's an outrage is what it is. An outrage.
I know, Hagrid, Ariel says. And I agree, but how can we stop it? I've already considered this at length, and I think the only option would be to kidnap one of them. Either Bela or Aegon. And to be frank, neither would be enthusiastic about a life on the run. Can you imagine how whiny Aegon would get after a few days without Arbor Red?
It'd be for Aegon's own bloody good if someone cut the lad off,
Hagrid grumbled.
And I know it's useless to work myself up over it, but it's making me ill.
Me too, Ariel said. But we have to support Bela. She will back her up if someone dares mistreat her, and it's not like there'll be a betting. At the mention of betting, Hagrid shuddered the same way as if Ariel had just blurted out the name Voldemort again. Exhaling heavily, Hagrid dipped his hippogriff feather quill into the inkwell, trying to tip against the side on the way up to prevent spillage.
I guess. It's a move, ain't it? That's what they keep telling me. Like she's moving from her father's island house to her uncle's home in the big city. There's more kids her age around here. More stuff to see and things to do. Her grandfather says the change can be good for Bela too.
Ariel snorted. Spun from such a narrative, it nearly sounded like Bela was going off to Hogwarts. Hagrid put his quill to the parchment and continued his shaky attempts at designing a coat of arms. After going over the amendments to Hagrid's reward and the marriage pact, they circled back to the matter of sigils, mostly for something lighter to discuss after wrecking their brain on how to best argue against sibling incest with a Targaryen. They'd pulled out writing equipment and used the duplication charm on the parchment. It didn't matter that it disappeared once the spell wore out, because they only needed it for sketching ideas, and wouldn't waste their limited supply of parchment on this. The Hogwarts crest is an elaborate coat of arms, and neither of us can draw, Ariel told Hagrid after an attempt to draw a badger resulted in a creature resembling a pudgy hamster instead. The coat of arms was supposed to be replicated by others, and though people might put considerable efforts into depicting the sigils accurate for more important houses, Ariel doubted they'd bother for such a minor one as Hagrid's. She could easily see it be simplified to a field of 4 colors, red, green, yellow and blue, because no one would bother to draw animals. Maybe they'd bother with the letter H in the middle, but since England used another alphabet than the one in Westeros, they wouldn't understand its meaning.
Oh, I just thought it could work for us both.
Maybe we should use something more manageable. Use 1 animal instead of 4?
We could stick to the Gryffindor lion.
It's near identical to the Lannister coat of arms. Ariel shook her head. And about this coat of arms, this isn't really us, Hagrid. It's your personal crest. Your land, your keep. And this represents the official coat of arms of House Hagrid. Ariel sighed.
House? I'm the last of my family,
Hagrid said. It's a tradition, Ariel said. As a lord of land and a keep, they'll have to document your coat of arms. And you're not the only one to be the sole person with a coat of arms. When a hedge knight enters a tourney, they'd have to use a sigil that represents themselves. And several of those men don't even have surnames, Ariel explained. Though as your named heir, I'd like to use your coat of arms as long as I can get away with it. But after marriage, my sigil will be a 3-headed dragon.
You'll be Ariel Targaryen.
Ariel frowned. No, the queen is still Alicent Hightower after marriage. Princess Rhaenys is still a Targaryen, not a Velaryon. But that might be because of their high birth. Brides are more likely to change their names when they marry, well, up. But keep their maiden names if their husband is from a lesser house? But the royals don't follow the same rules as nobles anyway. Hagrid remained confused, so Ariel expanded on her trail of thoughts. On one hand, House Targaryen hoards their name because they're royals, and at the same time it elevates the Queen's birth house using her maiden name. As Queen Alicent Hightower, House Hightower is directly linked to the crown every time someone talks of the Queen. It was the same with the previous queens from other houses. They've all kept their maiden names too. Unlike other noble houses, I can't think of anyone who's ever taken on the Targaryen name by anything except birthright, and I don't see why I'd be any different. They put talks of surname traditions aside to refocus on the coat of arms, cheerily discussing different ideas. From using a cracked golden dragon egg on a red field to a griffin, because if the Lannisters had the lion, there were other ways to honor Gryffindor. They tried putting Fang on it, then Hedwig, but their drawing skills failed them on those animals too, so Hagrid went to the other extreme. "What is it?" Ariel asked, unable to interpret what the straight line with the little star symbol on top was supposed to be.
"It's a wand casting magic."
Though they both liked the idea of using a wand, the tool wasn't a commodity in these lands, so nearly no one would understand it. They'd sooner mistake it for a bland shooting star going the wrong way. They spent the rest of the evening trying different things, from a pointed wizard's hat that was deemed too weird, to a lightning scar which Hariel vetoed on the spot. Hagrid even wondered about using a giant on the banner, but then Hagrid remembered House Umber already had that. In the end, they went to bed without a final suggestion. They'd have an early start the next morning, and neither wanted to risk accidentally sleeping in. As it neared noon, Hariel glimpsed the sun shining bright from a clear blue sky through the window. Hariel thanked the guard as he waved her ahead, allowing her into the royal family's wing. The bustling activity made Hariel weave between the people heading to and from rooms, her feet echoing as she rushed down the hallway. Hariel bit down on a profanity seeing Helena exiting her chamber, Lady Grace Wild at her heel, both dressed and ready to leave for the Great Sept. It was official then. Hariel was running late. So bloody late. Bela would kill her. "Lady Hariel?" Helena called as she dashed past them. "Good morning, Princess, I'll see you at the Sept," Hariel called back, reaching the end of the hall to the narrow spiral stairs leading up to the inner chamber. Where the hell had the time gone? Hariel had been up since before sunrise, but somehow still ended up running late. She'd showered and dressed for the wedding within Hagrid's expandable trunk, then headed by the twins' chamber to explain why she wouldn't be able to assist Bela get ready, before spending the rest of the hours with Otto Hightower in renegotiations. Though they hadn't come with many stipulations, the few they had resulted in exhausting haggling, and now it was already time to leave for the Sept. Her only saving grace was that Hariel had dressed for the wedding before starting her day, but she hadn't had an opportunity to do her hair, which was a minor crisis. Her charms could calm it, if only slightly, but the spells meant to magically braid it would 9 times out of 10 leave her hair resembling Hagrid's. To make it a little worse, when Hariel reached the top stairs, she was met with Sir Stefan guarding the twins' door. "Good morning, Sir Stefan," Hale said, nervously brushing fingers through her hair. "I'm here to see Lady Bela. Is the princess here as well? Her family?" "Good morning, Lady Hariel. Or isn't it closer to noon? Yes, the princess is inside, looking on her stepdaughters, but the princess are with her good father," Sir Stefan said. Princess Rhaenyra was only in the capital to attend her stepdaughter's wedding to her brother, and would return home early next morning, and had therefore left both Viserys and Visenya at Dragonstone. The princess was still mourning her recent losses, and refused to risk either of them catching illness by traveling. Upon entering the twins' chamber, it had turned far more cluttered since Hariel's previous visit at dawn. Breakfast and tea hadn't been cleaned away from the tables yet, fabrics and shawls laid out on available surfaces. The twins' chests were open with the contents spilling out, but despite the mess, the soldier itself looked twice as large as usual. Knowing Bela and Rhaena would spend the hours getting ready, Hariel spelled half the walls into smooth mirrors when she'd stopped by, and it seemed to have been put to good use. "I beg your pardon for my lateness. I couldn't get here sooner." "You've been in the Tower of the Hand this entire time?" Rhaena asked, turning away from the mirrored walls, the white skirts of her pretty blue gown flaring around her ankles. "I was," Hariel nodded. "Matters took longer than we anticipated." Bela stood ready in a deep red gown with white details they'd worked diligently on for the last couple of months. It had a flaring skirt of several layers, decorated with graceful embroideries that contained rubies, pearls, and dragonglass stitched into them. The back had 2 pearly dragon wings, folded in neatly from her shoulders and down along her back and trailing into her skirt. The rose-red gown had white hanging sleeves with white lining inside, and Bela's silvery ringlet hair was wrestled back into braids and crowned with a headpiece akin to an elegant French hood. Bela was a vision of loveliness. A shame it was for something that made Hariel physically unwell. Her eyes locked with Bela's purple irises in the mirror, and she mustered a small smile. What? Bela challenged. You look beautiful, Ariel said. Bela nodded, perfectly aware of it, but was fidgeting with her attire all the same. She'd already corrected her French hood twice and swished her skirts with the other hand. It was perfectly normal for a bride to be stressed on her wedding day, at least from what Ariel had heard. But was this that? Unlikely. What kept you? Princess Rhaenyra asked, looking over from her seat by the fireplace. Princess, I trust you've been made aware of the generous award your father's granted Hagrid for his services? I'm aware. Princess Rhaenyra waved off Ariel's explanation, getting up from her seat. That does not explain why Sir Otto would keep you on the morning of his grandson's wedding. Was it to do with your betrothal? It was. I accompanied Hagrid while he negotiated some of the stipulations. He doesn't read common tongue well, so it was for the better. Bela smirked, giving her a judgmental once-over. A challenging endeavor? It appears as if you've been running your fingers through your hair consistently since I saw you at dawn. Walking up to a mirror, Ariel checked that her bottle green gown set correctly while starting to untangle her hair. She quickly made sure the charms on the water lily embroideries was still making the flowers gradually open and close, since sometimes the spells started to have a life of their own. She didn't want the gentle flowers to suddenly start acting like ravenous little fly traps either. I've been there since sunrise and we only just came to an agreement. But you did come to an agreement? Rhaena asked, her eyes growing wide. Does this mean you're betrothed to Aemond? It does, Ariel said, her stomach doing a sudden flip out confirming it. Bloody hell. She was engaged to Aemond. So how come it didn't feel like it? Probably because she'd been put through hours of unpleasant discussions of sibling incest and sexism with Otto Bloody Hightower before it was realized. Aemond hadn't been there either, and since Sir Otto needed to get ready for the ceremony too, her betrothed probably wasn't even aware he was betrothed yet. Safe to say it was no one's idea of a fairy tale proposal, and likely why it didn't feel real yet. Nor was it made more so by the twins' lackluster reaction to the news. Oh. Bela pursed her lips, glancing swiftly out of the window, while Rhaena's expression turned into something between pity and annoyance. Unexpectedly, it was Rhaenyra who reacted appropriately. Congratulations on making such a fine match, Lady Ariel, Rhaenyra said. This means we'll be good sisters in a year's time. You'll be Bela's good sister as well. We'll have to mark it another day, though. Today is for Aegon and Bela, Rhaenyra said, straightening any creases in her dark gown. With the exception of her attire during her marriage to Daemon, the princess had only worn black since the death of her daughter, and today was no exception. It had details in red and gold, but otherwise it was a scaled black gown, tailored to flatter her curvy post-pregnancy body. We were just about to leave for the carriages. Bela came up beside Ariel while she was rushing to finish a side braid for her hair. We can't leave yet! Look at her hair! Bela said outraged. You're not attending my wedding with such a drab braid. It's ruining the gown. No, do better. There isn't time, Bela. I'll do something more appropriate between the ceremony and the reception. There's time to fix that before we leave, Bela said, grabbing Ariel's hand to prevent her from finishing her work. The ceremony, whatever are they going to do? Start without me? Bela smirked, though it didn't reach her eyes. I can do it. No, today you're the bride, Bela, not the lady-in-waiting. Rhaenyra waved Bela back to her seat. I'll do it. My princess, I don't mind doing it either, Rhaena insisted. You'll assist me. Lady Harold's hair can be a challenge and we're pressed for time. Princess Rhaenyra rebuffed and pushed Ariel into a chair in front of the mirrored walls, where she set to work with nimble fingers, trapping Ariel at the mercy of the princess, who now literally had her by the roots of her hair. What had you intended to do if given time? The princess wondered. I have a hairnet, a name they give from House Celticar, but did you bring it along? Ariel brought a hairnet out of her pocket, and Rhaena grabbed it while the princess set to work. The woman had thick hair reaching to her lower back, and the elaborate braids didn't do themselves. The heir to the throne had a personal maid who did her hair each day, but as Rhaenyra's ward, Hariel had assisted with the princess's hair more times than she could count. Now what addendum did Rubius Hagrid demand? Rhaenyra asked, accepting a brush from Rhaena to section Hariel's hair. To make it easier, Hariel removed her earrings to prevent the hair tangling in the hanging dragon wings. Since we've never been to Cracklaw, we required more information regarding the lands themselves, as well as details concerning the dragon requirements. Hagrid had some stipulations there. The Master of Coin had taken his example from the Dragon Pit, but Hagrid's amendments were in line with some of the same changes he's implemented on Dragonstone. Hariel didn't think Otto or the Targaryens likely to fool them regarding what sort of lands Hagrid was being gifted. If they tricked Hagrid with lands completely unsuitable for human habitation, the marriage pact meant they were tricking Aemond too. Was that everything discussed? How kind of you to spend the morning negotiating the exhausting details required in dragon-rearing structures, when it's a topic Lord Hagrid is far more knowledgeable in than yourself. Rhaenyra mused. It's not kindness, it's my inheritance, Hariel reminded the princess with an arched brow. Rhaenyra's hands briefly paused, before they started tugging again, pulling her locks back tightly, so much her scalp ached, but she didn't flinch or let it show. As Hagrid's heir, it would concern you as well. Somewhat, Rhaenyra said, sounding like she didn't believe it. Her tone irked, but the hard truth was that Hariel didn't believe it either. She might spend the rest of her life on Cracklaw as Hagrid's heir and so forth, but she'd never rule it. Aemond would, because by the time this became relevant, they'd be married, possibly for decades, and thereby anything Hariel owed would legally be his, which included inherited land and keep. The only way she would rule was if both Hagrid and Aemond were dead and she had no sons. So realistically, Hariel knew she would stay the passenger on someone else's broom. It'd hopefully be a nice, comfortable broom. That's what she was working to achieve. But the laws of Westeros made it nigh impossible for Hariel to steer it. The best she could do was guide Hagrid and hope he didn't crash them handle first into a cliffside. We had some stipulations regarding the marriage pact too, she said, starting to shift uneasily, but had to stop when the firm hold the princess had on her hair punished too much wiggling. What were they? Rhaenyra behaved entirely unsurprised by this, wanting the answers directly without Hariel's wavering. Nothing I haven't expressed before. Rhaenyra knew better than most what Hariel's views on marriage were. Sometimes Hariel's expectations had been utterly alien to Rhaenyra. Sometimes it'd be of great amusement to her, sometimes exasperation. But either way, she, Bela, Rhaena, and Septimega were the ones who'd heard the most. Just, we wanted some of the consideration I've enjoyed to be given to others too, Hariel filled in. I've been clear I won't marry until I'm 7 and 10, the coming of age of my homeland, so firstly we requested the same be done for Aemond. What does that mean? Rhaena asked, surprised, accepting a chunk of Hariel's sectioned hair to hold while the princess worked on the rest. That you will not marry before the princess 7 and 10? No, to wait until Aemond is 6 and 10 and of age according to Westerosi law, she specified. It was more reasonable to request they defer to their own laws than those of another country. We also had a few amendments regarding the unorthodox inheritance stipulations of the gift. Not so much after Hagrid as what happens after me, Hariel said, still unsure how she felt. It hadn't been a clean victory. If Hariel had her way, neither gender or order of birth would matter. Any inheritance wouldn't be monopolized by the firstborn son. It'd be split equally between all children, regardless of which order they came or of what gender they were born. That'd be the ideal solution, but she was realistic enough to see it would be extremely hard to achieve. In some ways, the dragon settlement made the offer more extravagant and locked them tighter, precisely because House Targaryen wouldn't let it fall into the hands of another house. The issue was that this went higher up than a mere contract. Even if Hariel changed the contract to state a firstborn regardless of gender would inherit, even if she somehow talked Aemond and Otto to sign it, maybe even the king himself, Hariel knew the day the issue became relevant, likely decades in the future when Viserys was dead, the contract would be contested by a cousin or potentially even a son, and they'd have legal grounds to claim it invalid. Because just like back home, it was certainly possible to write a contract stating that someone had the sole responsibility to, for example, take out the garbage every day for the rest of their lives, but that alone didn't make it a legal document. Such wording went against British slavery laws that stated to bind someone to a task without payment and without the possibility of breaking it for life was slavery, and thereby illegal, even if all parties involved signed it. She was less certain about the Muggles, but that's how the law was in the magical community. Hagrid knew of it because somehow, in ways he'd never wanted to explain in depth, he'd come across some irregularities with this law himself when he was expelled from Hogwarts, since it was uncertain how Hagrid was categorized. A human where such labor laws were illegal, or a creature where that was legal. Which was a whole other can of worms Ariel had to push aside. She could only handle so many injustices at a time, and didn't like reminding that Hogwarts wasn't as perfect as her memories insisted. Though just like England had laws to prevent people from signing away their freedom, according to Westerosi laws, to favor a daughter before a son could be judged to be an illegal document, because the Westerosi legalization for the continent still stated a son inherited before any daughter. This was why Rhaenyra's standing was so bloody shaky. With the king's blessing, she was an exception, and after nearly 2 decades as named heir, that standing had solidified. Not enough when every other house in the 6 kingdoms did not follow the same law. Except the 7th, in Dorne, but they weren't under Targaryen rule, which often made Ariel wonder how it was like to live in Dorne. But daydreaming aside, to make an arrangement with lasting solidity, Ariel would somehow have to convince King Viserys to change the Westerosi laws to favor firstborns regardless of gender. Thus Viserys hadn't even done that for his daughter's Rhaenyra's security of rule, Ariel wasn't liking her chances of convincing him to change it for her hypothetical future daughter. We wanted it stated that if Aemond and I... Ouch! Ariel hissed when the princess tugged painfully while forcing a braid into place. Though Rhaenyra's grip eased up. If we only have daughters, the eldest would inherit before cousins or uncles. It was the best Ariel could think of as feasible, but even that was difficult in their odd little inheritance balancing act. Again because of Westerosi marriage laws, which stated when a woman married, the bride became part of her husband's governing. Though in reality it was another way of saying that in marriage, a girl didn't have anything of her own. Not her belongings, not her body, not even her children were legally hers. They belonged to her husband's governing first. Rhaena frowned. Why would such need be negotiated? That is how it is. In theory, Ariel allowed, mentally adding on, but not in practice. Because if anyone took the clause that favored daughters before cousins and uncles seriously, Daemon wouldn't have been called the king's heir for the first decade of Viserys' rule when the king already had a daughter. Daemon had to be personally exiled and disinherited altogether before Rhaenyra was recognized as heir. For that matter, if the lords of Westeros upheld this custom in practice the way they claimed it was a thing in theory, then King Viserys himself would never have been voted to hold the Iron Throne to begin with, and Princess Rhaenys would have been called the Queen of Westeros, as she'd held a clear superior claim. It was curious that Rhaena, the woman's own granddaughter, would ignore where the title of Queen Who Never Was originated from. It went further back too. Before Viserys, Jaehaerys should not have been crowned king ahead of his niece, Aeria Targaryen, the girl considered heir of everyone on paper until Jaehaerys staked his claim to the throne, and that princess had mostly been forgotten since except when someone would bring up her brutally painful death. Though House Targaryen had a clause that overlooked any daughters as heirs in the initial agreement. That was a necessary addition, the princess explained to Rhaena. There'll be dragons there, which isn't an inheritance that can pass to the unworthy. Ariel locked eyes with her own reflection in the mirror and could make sure her expression didn't slip. Though it wasn't what the princess meant, it sounded an awful lot like she'd called her hypothetical daughter unworthy of inheritance. That wasn't quite what she'd meant, and yet at the same time it was. There you go, Ariel. Rhaenyra finished her hair. She'd braided a thick braid that sat like a flower crown across her head, where the hairnet was fastened and kept the rest of her hair back. "Thank you so very much, Your Grace," Ariel murmured, getting up from her chair. They'd worked quickly and efficiently, and now there was nothing to delay anymore. "Shall we leave for the cabbages then?" Renina asked, phrased as a question but without room to argue. Bela had already dressed and brushed imaginary dust from the winter coat that hid her gown underneath. "We shall, Princess." Everyone collected their belongings and dressed for a cold trip from the castle to the Great Sept, before heading down the hall as a group escorted by Sir Stefan. Ariel's mind was still spinning, concerned over Bela's restlessly tense attitude. Princess Rhaenyra continued the topic from the chamber, curious to know how Sir Otto had reacted to their stipulation that pushed for her daughter to inherit. The issue for the Targaryens was that if Ariel's daughter inherited the dragon enclosure with any dragons in exile on those lands, that inheritance could potentially end up in the possession of another house through her daughter's marriage. A reality Ariel couldn't picture House Targaryen allowing out of generosity and trustworthiness alone. People would object to that nearly as fiercely as if the dragon pit ended up inherited by the Hightowers through the king's marriage to Alicent. So they'd either force Ariel's daughter to marry a Targaryen cousin, or otherwise disinherit her outright to guarantee it went directly to Aegon, Jace, Daeron, or anyone else with a legal right to pass on the surname Targaryen to another generation. And in practice, realistically, and maybe even selfishly, was that what Ariel wanted for her daughter? To only be allowed to inherit by marrying another Targaryen and play into their incest practices? When this imaginary future daughter wouldn't even be the ruler of its inheritance, neither in name or practice once married. So what mattered more? A daughter's inheritance, or some freedom in whom she married? Where she lived, or whom she lived with? Ariel knew what it felt like to lose her inheritance. It had stung badly, but she'd learned to live with it, and personally felt the latter counted more than the former. If she'd ever been made to pick between being stuck in Westeros with Hagrid, or alternatively with her gold from her lost vault in Gringotts, it was a no-brainer. And Ariel didn't know this girl she was worrying over. Would she be a Helena type or a Bela type? A Hermione type? Ariel didn't even know if she'd have a daughter. She might only have sons. She might die giving birth like Lena did. The baby might die like Emma did. She might be barren. What the hell did Ariel know? Certainly not the future. Ariel had to pick and choose her battles here. So Hagrid and Ariel had put forth the stipulation that a daughter could inherit before cousins or uncles, but though they had some traction there, it had not ended in a clear agreement. "It was left a bit ambiguous, to be honest," Ariel said. "It's not stated that a daughter can't inherit, but it isn't stated that she absolutely will either. It had been pushed to a murky corner of, let's revisit the matter when there's a daughter to discuss. And in the end, it wasn't the hill Ariel had decided she'd die on anyway." That aside, the Hand accepted a couple amendments to the marriage pact. She told the princess as they reached the bottom of the stairs. Any child will not be married before they are of age, and no siblings will marry each other. It's stating that in your marriage pact. Though the princess kept her expression neutral, Ariel could have sworn she saw a glint of satisfaction cross her face. It does. Was Ariel imagining things? The princess had married her own uncle, and happily so. Considering how proud Rhaenyra was of the Targaryen incest practices, Ariel expected her to be offended by the amendment, especially after the hassle Otto gave them. It had not been an easy fight to push through. One thing was trying to dictate what happened to a child of Ariel's. Another was arguing the same for Aemon's, as trying to lord over how a prince raised some hypothetical future kid was an extremely delicate matter. It wasn't even because Otto outright disagreed with the terms either. No, it was how their religious beliefs stated that the father ruled his household, and to add stipulations that stripped Aemond of his rights broke the laws of both gods and men. It was at that point Hagrid was sidelined for good. The pretense that this discussion was happening between Hagrid and Otto while Ariel translated, falling to the shreds as Ariel started her own quite aggressive religious counter-arguments. The faith names incest sinful. They always have and still do. And our children will form a line of Targaryen lords and ladies, not princes and princesses, so that they should not be included in the incest exceptions the faith made with the crown. Harold told the Hand, mimicking the same religious tone Sir Otto always veiled his arguments in. The one that indicated the Hand was merely the mouthpiece of kings and gods, and arguing against the will of the gods was a hell of a lot harder than protesting the ambitious desires of a man. And this was the latter. Allowing sibling incest has only ever been an exception in the ruling line, while no child born from a Targaryen who is married outside the line of succession upholds the incest practices, she reminded the Hand, and then started dumping hard facts to back up her meaning. How children of a king were treated was one thing, while children of princes and princesses was another. Aemma Arryn hadn't married her half-sibling, but her cousin Viserys, which was allowed in the eyes of the Seven. Nor had Rhaenys Targaryen upheld the Valyrian marriage traditions after marrying into another Valyrian house. Nor Laenor or Laena, despite all examples being descendants from a sibling marriage between Jaehaerys and Alysanne. Had Princess Rhaenys been ignorant enough to try to marry Laenor and Laena to each other in the practices of her house, even with Corlys Velarion's full support, the faith would not have accepted it. And why? Because despite being a Targaryen princess, Rhaenys was not in the line of succession. Even if Prince Aemond was a man, as the seventh in line to the throne, arguably eighth if Visenya was allowed to inherit before uncles and cousins, he wasn't realistically expected to sit that ugly chair either, nor any of his kids. With Haryl's head wrung out, they eventually came to an agreement. At first she'd left relieved, and pleased to have the Hand of the King agree to the addendum. Yet now a sense of doubt crept up her spine. Perhaps Otto was always going to relent to those terms. Maybe it had been a strategy to keep them arguing about incest and age restrictions, since it successfully distracted them from discussing a daughter's right of inheritance. And now, as he'd accepted the renegotiated marriage pact, Harold hadn't exactly signed away a daughter's inheritance completely, but she wasn't fond of the ambiguity either. She had first-hand experience with how the crown handled murky deals. Maybe their demands hadn't seemed like much on paper, no sibling incest and no underage marriages, but it hadn't been nothing either. The stipulations they succeeded in had been highly necessary, and it didn't take more than a single glance at her 12-year-old friend to validate her conviction. They'd reached the carriages, and as Bela reached out to support herself against the doorframe, Ariel noticed the Hand was shaking. Unsurprisingly, the sept was already filled by the time they arrived, though few remained outside either waiting or late themselves. Prince Daemon was waiting for his daughter alongside Princess Rhaenys, though the two kept a noticeable distance from each other, the shadow of Laenor's passing lowering the temperature colder than the beautiful winter day already provided. The Master of Whisperers, Lord Larys Strong, was aided by a guard while struggling his way up the stairs. His misshapen foot made it hard for him to get around, as nowhere in King's Landing came with a handicap ramp. Maybe it was partly why he struggled too, but then she noticed his pale, sweaty pallor and sunken eyes, and wondered if the man was well enough to be out of bed, far less attending a wedding. He looked like he'd come back from the dead. The last person Harold recognized was Aemond, dressed sharply in a red and black sherwani underneath a dark, side-draped cavalier shoulder cape for his brother's wedding, and he caught her eye the moment she reached the top of the stairs. Bela's arrival meant the wedding was about to start, so there wasn't much time for chatting, but the way Aemond kept glancing at her made it obvious he hadn't spoken with his grandfather Otto yet. He was worried, and it'd be cruel to leave him wondering. When they headed inside, Harold pulled him aside by the hand, thumb brushing over his knuckles to reassure his uncertainty. "Where were you this morning?" "Aegon," Aemond said shortly, his tone bordering on exasperated, and left it at that. "What of you? You look lovely, but did Hagrid get a chance to meet with my grandfather this morning?" "We were there, and we accepted," she told him, grinning when Aemond's eyes lit up. "Thought you ought to know." "We're betrothed?" "We are," Harold confirmed. After a stressful morning, from Otto's harsh negotiations to the mellow reactions from the twins, Aemond's happiness was a welcome difference. Sure, after everything his delight had been expected, but at the same time if anyone's reaction mattered, it was Aemond's. Though you have little idea what you're getting into, Aemond. You'll be under our roof after all. Aemond lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, making Haryl's cheeks heat. I can... Prince Aemond, Lady Hariel, we have to head inside now. Princess Rhaenys cut Aemond off and wait for them to get moving. While Baela remained with her father by the door, the rest headed inside. Aemond, Rhaenyra, Rhaenys and Rhaena joined the front row where House Targaryen stood together, while Hariel took a quick left to find a vantage point to watch the ceremony from. The Great Septon King's Landing was enormous compared to the one at Dragonstone. The structure itself was far grander, but Hariel couldn't make herself like it. Cold daylight streamed through tall, narrow windows high on the grey stone walls. The large statues of the gods looked down on them from the 7 corners of the hall, glaring judgmentally at the crowd as if simply stepping through the door turned them all into sinners. The only nicety of the place were the hundreds of flickering candles, giving warmth to an otherwise frigid, dark cave of a hall. The combined effect made Hariel feel stuck inside an oversized mausoleum, built as the grave of something greater than humans. The center of the 7-cornered hall had a circular table brimming with candles, and a 7-pointed star hovering above it by a chain from the ceiling. That was where Aegon stood with the High Septon, illuminated by the twinkling candles behind him while waiting for the ceremony to start. The spectators spread out around them, circling the altar in the middle. Though the set was more crowded than Hariel had ever seen, she'd easily located Hagrid in a comfortable spot near the animalistic statue of the stranger.
I wondered where you'd gone off to,
Hagrid said in English.
Was starting to think you might miss it.
I almost did. The echoing effect of the hall made Hariel keep her voice to a low murmur, and added on quietly just as the wedding started. And I kind of wish I had. The voices hushed as people turned towards the doors, where Baela just appeared with her father. As uncomfortable as Hariel had been with everything, the sight of Baela starting her march up the aisle was the moment it truly hit, when a severe reality sunk in. She was attending Baela's wedding. Hariel had known it theoretically, and been perfectly aware of the date of the ceremony from a strictly logical standpoint. But now, standing in a set with hundreds of others watching Baela walk towards Aegon made her not just nauseous, but furious too. She wasn't old enough for this! Baela's expression was one of determined stubbornness, her shoulders back and her head kept high. She wasn't one to see herself as a victim, and even now didn't want anyone else to see her so either. Yet, never had Hariel thought her smaller. As proud, confident and gracious as Baela tried to be, to Hariel it looked an awful lot like a kid playing dress-up, because she couldn't hide how physically minor she was. Underneath it all, Baela radiated an aura not unlike someone preparing for a collision. That was not how anyone should feel on their wedding day. Why hadn't Hariel just grabbed Baela and ran? Why hadn't Daemon, or Jace, Rhaenys Corlys? It should have been her family's duty to give Baela time to grow into a woman. So why did the king assume marrying a son to a child would make Aegon more of a man? Where was the bloody logic in that? Daemon escorted Baela from the doors, up a cleared carpeted path towards Aegon waiting underneath the large 7-pointed star. The prince stood straight, uncharacteristically severe, and paid attention as Daemon and Baela reached him, and the septum started the ceremony. They made their 7 vows, 7 blessings and 7 promises, and the hall rang with voices when the septum led the crowd through a wedding song. It was rather boring proceedings, all the way up until the old septum spoke a challenge against the marriage, a dare to oppose the union of Aegon Targaryen and Baela Targaryen, and Hariel was left torn. Yes, Hariel bloody hell wanted to oppose the marriage. Luckily several others did too, but what was the point of asking consent now, when no one had before? Where was this thoughtful room to back out of the marriage when Baela was first betrothed? No one had asked her consent then or since, and Hariel didn't think anyone had asked Aegon's preferences either. But now they saw fit to ask it from a random crowd? What could anyone say at this point? The silence of the hall was absolute, the challenge gone unanswered. Daemon stepped up to Baela, kissed his daughter gently on the head, and then removed the Targaryen maiden cloak from her shoulders. Once Daemon stepped back, Aegon placed a new bridal cloak on Baela's small shoulders. With the Targaryen sigil blazed across the back of both garments, the two being near identical, Harold could almost pretend Bela had simply slipped on her maiden cloak again. Aegon took Bela's hand and they turned together towards the septon. It was as if she'd adopted Helena's struggles with eye contact, because Harold kept averting her gaze. The discomforting scene unfolding made her focus on everything else while the long and winded ceremony dragged on, her mind grasping for any distraction. Was this how her own wedding would be like? Harold glanced towards the Targaryens, but the crowd blocked her line of sight, and the only one she glimpsed was a little of Queen Alicent and Jace. Since most of Aemon's family lived nearby, the likelihood of being in the same sept was quite high, but you couldn't picture as many spectators. Simultaneously, Harold kept comparing this to the simple ceremony between Rhaenyra and Daemon a fortnight before. As incestuous and outrageous as that had been, their wedding had been for them, and no one else but the two marrying. The fact Daemon and Rhaenyra disregarded everyone else's opinion, from their mourning children to House Valarian's reaction to the king's wishes, was the source of the scandalous problem with their union. However, when comparing that to this wedding, Harold wasn't sure who it was for, but certainly not Aegon and Bela. They were the only ones who hadn't had a say, and if Harold had to pick between the two methods, she would honestly rather have a wedding akin to what Rhaenyra and Daemon had than this circus. The wedding proceeded with songs, more prayers, and the old septum spoke his fair piece too, before it was nearly at its end. With this kiss I pledge my love, and take you for my lady and wife. Aegon's voice carried across the hall as he took Bela's hand in his. With this kiss I pledge my love, and take you for my lord and husband. Bela parroted as Aegon leaned down and kissed her. An act which made Harold want to crawl out of his skin and renew the urge to get out. It was ironic how such a large space was making her feel claustrophobic. She'd rather have her old cupboard than this. Bela linked her arm through Aegon's elbow as the old septon raised his voice. You've made your oaths of unity to the seven who are one, and I declare you one flesh, one heart, one soul, now and forever. After the ceremony, Harold leant against the side of the sept, moving sludge on the ground back and forth with her foot. The groom and bride had been put into the first carriage headed for the Red Keep, followed closely by the second with the king, queen, Rhaenyra and Daemon. The rest remained a disorganized chaos lingering at the steps in front of the Great Sept as people waited for carriages to bring them back to the castle, when she noticed a second straggler dallying where he shouldn't. The carriages can't make it up the stairs, my prince. You'll have to head down to the road, Ariel said, smiling kindly to the only other person who seemed as uncomfortable with the ceremony as herself and Hagrid were. Hearing her remark, Jace turned around, a hand running through his dark hair. She'd seen him briefly within the sept too during the wedding. He'd been tight-lipped, his attention angled towards the massive star dangling above the couple instead of looking directly at them. Even now he stood straight with his chin jutted out, feigning indifference. You'd be better to follow your own advice then, Lady Ariel, he answered shortly. Are you... Ariel trailed off, realizing it was useless to ask how Jace was doing here. There were too many within earshot. More likely than not, he'd feel awkward and lie, then answer truthfully. Where's Helena? She asked instead. With her brothers, Jace said, glancing down the stairs in the direction they likely were. Ariel had so many questions she wanted to ask. How did he feel? Did he like Helena? Was he angry, resigned, accepting, indifferent? How could anyone remain indifferent about who their life partner would be, though? Bela and Helena had been pretty transparent with their feelings, but Harold had little idea where Jacaerys and Aegon stood. Though Jace and Bela had only ever courted, they'd basically swapped fiancés, and that alone made things awkward during dinners. Would it be better or worse now that Bela and Aegon were married? Jace smiled, but his jaw was tense enough that even with his sparkling dark eyes and easy grin, she judged it a fake expression. If you've been abandoned to your own devices, you can join my carriage up to the keep, Lady Ariel. I'm sure there'll be room for one more. That's a gracious offer, but I'll pass, Prince Jacaerys. I'm walking back to the castle with Hagrid, he said, and nodded towards where Hagrid stood talking with Vaemond Valarian and his son Sir Daeron. None of the carriages can carry him. I see, Jace said, nodding. Then you'd better be on your way. It's a long walk. He wasn't wrong, and Ariel had the feeling Jace craved some privacy. It's likely why he'd walked away from his family. So she pushed away from the wall, but as she passed him, Ariel paused, feeling torn. "You did well in there," she said quietly. "And I'm sorry." Her words triggered a spark of emotion in the 12-year-old prince, and Ariel could sense the gears moving rapidly within Jace's mind. "If you're so remorseful, how come you advised the king for this outcome?" he asked shortly, almost as if he'd been unable to hold the words back. The accusation took her unawares. How did he know? Did he know, though? What did Jace know, and what did he guess? "I never advised this to the king," Hale denied, hushing her voice and casting her gaze around for eavesdroppers. People seemed preoccupied with their own activities, but it was impossible to tell. Jace's eyes narrowed, and she rushed to defend herself before he accused her further. I said Helena could heal the rift in your house, and your name was brought up there. But I never said anything about Bela and Aegon. Their betrothal surprised me as much as it did you. Yet how was any of these matters your business to discuss in the first place?" Jace asked harshly. "It wasn't," Hale admitted. "I had one conversation with His Grace, but that's all it was. I talked to him about the reality outside the Red Keep, what people think, and I mentioned Helena's wishes to marry you. But I didn't cause a situation that made the king agree. Had I been speaking nonsense, there'd be no reason for His Grace to have heeded my report at all." Jace frowned. Our betrothal was Helena's suggestion? Harold was surprised Helena wouldn't have told him that already. Initially, yes, but it was the king who made the decision to go over your mother's intentions. Jace glanced down the crowd, frowning. Oh. What did you think it was? I assumed it came from you, that you favored my betrothal to Helena since you planned to marry Aemond, Jace answered. After spending a whole morning with Sir Otto, it took Hariel only a split second to know Jace was thinking politically. He assumed Hariel had tried maneuvering Helena to Queen, because that way her children with Aemond would be the cousins of the future king of Westeros. It was politically smart, but so damn insulting. Jace knew Bela was her friend, and he'd insinuated Hariel had been scheming with nothing but her own advantages in mind at the cost of Bela. As if it had been easy. As if Hariel had wanted to pick between the hammer and the anvil, and not been maneuvered into the position by House Targaryen themselves. Not to mention how Hariel hadn't picked anything at all. What she'd done was show support for Helena over Bela, favoring the option most likely to be peaceful. Did Jace see that? Even if he was young, as a future king who would be forced to make these decisions himself, she really hoped he did. You don't know me very well, do you? Ariel chuckled humorously. If I was only doing things for personal gain, I'd have kept my mouth shut about the tensions I've observed, ignored Helena's suggestion, and set my eyes on another second son with a greater inheritance, wouldn't I? She asked pointedly. Jace opened his mouth, but seemed to realize the truth of it. If this was only about personal gain, Ariel could have tried for a betrothal with Luke instead, an avenue where she wouldn't have had to hurt Bela's feelings at all. If Jace and Bela were king and queen, Luke would be the king's brother and the wealthiest man in Westeros. A superior inheritance than the brother of the queen whose only claim to inheritance would be for his wife. She is nothing like Bela, but Helena's very sweet. Please give her a chance, Jace. I'm aware she's sweet, Jace said. If anything, I was concerned Helena might be too sweet. But considering this, mayhaps I was mistaken. Mayhaps you were. Jace looked at Hariel, the tense accusation shimmering in his eyes giving way for confusion, as if he couldn't figure her out and was left utterly indecisive whether she was an idiot or not.